we go. So as of now, our Custom House first Friday on May 1st, 2020 is being recorded. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joan Whitlow, our Executive Director of the Custom House Maritime Museum in Newburyport, to introduce our speaker. Joan.
Well, thank you, Jack, and thank you for being our tech support tonight and going over the housekeeping items. As he said, welcome everybody. This is really quite exciting. This is our second public open community First Friday social. We've already exceeded the numbers from last April. I see at least 84 right now. At the moment there was 85, but I guess when you started to record, someone dropped. But perhaps I just wanted to talk a few moments before introducing our guest speaker. I wanted to reassure everyone that the museum is doing quite well. We remain closed, but Sean Palmetier, the assistant director, and I have been busy with getting the exhibitions ready to open whenever that is deemed possible and safe. We're really excited to share those results, and those who have peeked in recently have been very surprisingly pleased with what they see. So I'm really happy and excited to be showing that off in the oncoming weeks ahead. The Potters of the Merrimack River, the exhibition, Century of New England Pottery, closed end of April. Well, actually that closed probably March 18th when we decided not to reopen our doors. But we're getting ready for a new exhibition that we are on schedule to open June 5th. And that exhibition is entitled Entertainment for Man and Horse: Victuals, Libations, and Distractions in an Early American Tavern. We hope to recreate a tavern in the Bushy Gallery as part of a larger one-year initiative that will provide collaborative programming with the theme based around the tavern. The Customs House Maritime Museum plans to host community and member events that bring historic musical performances, storytelling, beer and wine tasting, and even an early American gaming night. The intent is to have a platform in which we can come together after a period of social disruption. And in some instances, some nonprofits may not have a venue, and the Customs House Maritime Museum wants to provide that opportunity. In addition to the gallery changes, we have been working on the building to address the basement windows and water drainage with the gutters, just basic care to preserve the integrity of a historical structure. I feel so much privileged to be in the past few weeks a building all by myself that most draws 1,500 visitors a year. And some days I hear the wind howl off the Merrimack, and then other days I hear footsteps in the attic. I understand there may be more to this story, so tune in with Facebook and Instagram to see what it is like to be alone in the Customs House. Speaking of libations, I hope everyone is enjoying a beverage from one of our two sponsors for the First Friday, the Newburyport Brewing Company and the New England Wine and Spirits. So cheers to all the essential workers. This is a social. I hope everybody else has a drink besides myself. Clink. And then getting back to business, we're really here for Kevin McDonald's presentation. Many of you know Kevin personally, but I only overlapped with him a few short weeks. Kevin had been the curator for the Customs House collection of 18th and 19th century maritime trade artifacts, decorative arts, and historic documents. He drove up from Hopkinton, Massachusetts, every Friday to volunteer while balancing his day job with IBM, where he's worked over the last 20 years. He's currently working on the Watson's IBM portfolio of artificial intelligence services. Kevin really first impressed me with his steel trap mind for dates, names, and places. I quickly knew he had a talent to tell stories and provided enough background to jog my own recollection of historical circumstances. Kevin is passionate about Newburyport's history, and many were disappointed to learn of his departure last October. Kevin studied at the Harvard University, where he earned a master's degree in museum studies. He also has a master's in writing from Northeastern University. He's currently volunteering at the Worcester Historical Museum, assisting with an 18-month project to renovate the Bellwether Fuller Gallery, which showcase Worcester's industrial and manufacturing history over the past 200 years. Sadly, we lost Kevin. Gratefully, I am sure Worcester Historical Museum is happy to have him now. So tonight, I'm happy to present Kevin, Hoist the Red Flag, Epidemic and Quarantine in early Newburyport. Thank you for joining us, Kevin.
All right. Thank you. It's really great for me to be on. I'm very grateful that the board of directors, and specifically Sue Bernard and Jack Santos, reached out and asked me to present. And it's really good for me to be back. I've missed the community here, and I see many names right now of people online that I recognize. So I'm glad to be back and have the opportunity to speak with folks. So let me see if I can get this thing going here. All right, I hope everybody is privy to the screen at this point. Yes, I hope.
Yes.
All right. So when Susan asked me to present, I guess I didn't have to think too hard about what would be a relevant topic right now. Here we are on the 1st of May, 2020, and the whole reason we're meeting like this online virtually is because of the ongoing global pandemic around the current outbreak of the COVID-19 novel coronavirus. And as we all observe mandatory quarantine restrictions, I believe that it can help to look to past episodes of different epidemics to hopefully provide a more complete understanding of our current situation. So while New England's history traditionally begins with the landing of the Puritan separatists at Plymouth aboard the Mayflower in 1620, in reality, there had already been about 100 years of contact between Native American Indians and Europeans, particularly French fur trappers and Portuguese fishermen. These Europeans brought diseases which the natives had no immunity to. This included smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, cholera. As an example, the Passamaquoddy people of what is today southern Maine were among the first to make contact with French fur traders in the early 1500s. In 1586, the Passamaquoddy experienced an outbreak of typhus, and that reduced their population from an estimated maybe 20,000 to something like 4,000 at the turn of the 17th century. So this map on the left was published by Captain John Smith. He was instrumental in establishing the first English presence in the New World at Jamestown in 1607. In 1614, Smith had actually come in the coastal area between Maine and Massachusetts, and that is what this map is depicting here. It was during this expedition that the captain of one of Smith's other ships captured 20 Native American men and ended up returning them to Spain, actually, for sale as slaves. One of those captives was Tisquantum, Squanto that we know from the Pilgrim story, a Patuxet tribesman who ended up making his way from Spain to England. It was also in this year, in 1616, that one of those European diseases began to move down the coast from Maine to Massachusetts. It's what they call the New England Coastal Plague. And while it's unknown what the disease actually was, I think some of the more recent theories based on some contemporary descriptions of what people were suffering, I've heard that it could be leptospirosis, which is a blood infection caused by bacteria, and it causes a jaundice, kidney failure, and eventual pulmonary hemorrhage. So it's a kind of a nasty thing. So many of the native population died over the next 3 years that estimates of a 90% fatality rate are common. The Massachusetts tribe, for example, declined from an estimated population of about 4,500 in 1616 to about 400 3 years later. When the Pawtuxet captive Tisquantum managed to make his way back to his native village in 1619, he discovered he was the last of the Pawtuxet people. His whole tribe had been totally wiped out by the epidemic. When the Puritans landed the following year, at the site of his native village, their colony's existence actually rested, of course, with his survival skills and his ability to speak English. John Smith actually did return also to New England in 1620 and wrote in his journal something that many of the pilgrims believed, which was, quote, "God had laid this country open for us, where I had seen 100 or 200 people. Now there is scarcely 10 to be found." So about 10 years after the settlement of Plymouth, there was a smallpox epidemic that raged through the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was a pattern that would repeat itself on average about every 10 years for the next century and a half. Smallpox is a viral infection. It's very contagious. It begins with fever and vomiting, and then it progresses to a really bad skin rash. You get fluid-filled bumps that, if you survive, leaves behind an extensive scarring and many times blindness. So this wave from 1630 to 33, by the time it ended, there's an estimate that about only 750 American Indians were left in Massachusetts. And most of those were relocated into Christian villages of praying Indians. More locally along the Merrimack, in New Hampshire, the Pennacook Indians, which are depicted in the slide here, had already been weakened by tribal raids from Mohawk Indians when the epidemic hit in 1616, the coastal plague, and then when smallpox followed up in 1630, their numbers had fallen to only around about 1,500. The Pennacook chief on the right there, Chief Passaconaway, he's known for being one of the first chiefs to lease land to English settlers in New England, including in the area around the Newbury. Also by 1633, two other Pennacook tribes in Massachusetts, the Agawam in Ipswich and the Nomkeag in Salem, had been almost completely eradicated. And a year later, in 1634, the original settlers of Newbury Plantation arrived in Ipswich and moved to the Parker River site in Newbury the following spring in 1635. During the first 100 years of Newbury's existence, there were several documented instances of widespread disease. Measles is the first we'll talk about, and you can see there's quite a few different outbreaks that have been recorded during the 18th century. It's a highly contagious airborne disease, measles. The symptoms include a high fever and rash, and in the 1600s, fatality rates actually could be as high as 50% in populations that hadn't been previously exposed to it, including the Native Americans. Children also were under 5 were particularly susceptible. Years here. The outbreak in 1713 in Boston was particularly bad, and its progression was documented by the well-known Puritan minister, Cotton Mather, in his own household, which consisted of himself, his wife, 9 children, and a maid. Over a 6-week period in October and November, the entire family became infected, and Mather's wife, newborn twins, 2-year-old daughter, and the maid all died, leading to, in his household at least, a 45% fatality rate. You can see some of his diary entries here. From October 18th, when he notes that measles is just coming to town, to about 7 weeks later, 6-7 weeks, that the family is now left without any infants in it or anybody under the age of 7. Yellow fever was sort of the next wave that came through. In general, yellow fever causes a mild sort of flu-like symptoms with nausea and vomiting. In 15% of cases, though, yellow fever enters a second phase that causes jaundice, which is where the name of the disease comes from. And it causes liver and kidney damage and very heavy bleeding that leads to a fatality rate, usually of greater than 50%. The first definitive yellow fever outbreak in North America is detailed in Spanish records from around the year 1647, and it's in Barbados and the Yucatan Peninsula. By the following year, in 1648, Boston, Charleston, South Carolina, New York, all had documented quarantine measures for ships that were coming from the West Indies, and every port town, including something like Newburyport, would be susceptible to minor yellow outbreak fevers every summer. In fact, they sometimes, you can see in the cartoon here, called this Yellow Jack, and it was because of his association with ships and sailors. Now, because surviving the infection actually provided a lifelong immunity, very severe outbreaks were only suffered in the Northeast about once per generation. Scarlet fever came through Newbury in 1722. There's a note in Joshua Coffin's sketch of the history of Newbury, Newburyport, and West Newbury, where he cites the journal of Stephen Jakes that shows an outbreak of fever and distemper in Rowley in 1722, continuing through the next year in Newbury. And you can see the notification here, 40 people died in 1 month in April. And by the next month, May 3rd, that's it. Nobody has distemper anymore. Influenza, that was something that really hadn't been seen until about 1732 here in the colonies. But in mid-September of that year, in Salem, you start to see descriptions in the newspaper and different colonial accounts of general colds that begin to spread rapidly. So within 3 weeks, those general colds are noted as all along to the eastward, even as far as Casco, so all the way up to Maine, Casco Bay. And this is probably the first solid evidence of influenza in the colonies. The first evidence of what we would think of too probably as a pandemic, which is, you know, an epidemic with a multi-country spread. On October 5th, it was reported that there were no cases in any town south of Boston, but by the end of the month, it was in Newport, Rhode Island, and in towns along the Connecticut coast. It was in New York and Philadelphia by December, and some indications that it made its way down to the southern colonies, but generally the northern colonies were the hardest hit. Like influenza today, newspapers noted that most, or if not many or most deaths were of elderly or infirm people. For example, Salem newspaper notes that several, as they said, aged standers had died, while Nantucket noted the deaths of several aged people. And I think one of the other interesting things about this specific episode of influenza is that the colonies infected the mother country in England, where the following year they started to report the same rapidly moving sickness in 1733. Of all these illnesses, though, recurrent smallpox was probably the most familiar to the early colonials. As noted earlier, major outbreaks would occur something like every 10 years. And so happens just weeks after Newburyport separated from Newbury to form its own town in 1764, the selectmen had to adopt measures to prevent the spread of smallpox through the community. As noted in Currier's History of Newburyport, on March 17th, selectmen who actually were granted a warrant to take possession of 2 sloops that had lately come from Boston, where smallpox is prevalent. By April 16th, all vessels coming from Boston to Newburyport were to be stopped below the half-tide rocks. And then just 2 days later, guards were posted at the various bridge roads into Newbury and Newburyport to inspect travelers for signs of smallpox. By May, the town had set up a hospital in the Great Pasture in Newbury, and they used that to quarantine people who had smallpox, but they also had set that hospital up for inoculation purposes. Now, inoculation was a contentious issue throughout most of the 18th century, particularly in Massachusetts. You can see in the picture on the right here, people would be purposely cut by a doctor and then directly infected with discharge from the sores of a smallpox victim. And you remember Cotton Mather, that's the fellow on the left there. That's the Puritan minister who lost half his household to measles in 1713. He was a man of science and kept up with some of the latest doings in his day. And he had read of an endorsement of inoculation by a Turkish doctor in 1716. And he decided that he would press Boston's doctors to try inoculation if smallpox reached the colony again. Well, so of course, 5 years later, the disease returned with a ship from the West Indies. And in April of 1721, Mather worked with Dr. Zabdiel Boylston, who tried out the procedure on his youngest son and 2 of his slaves, and they all recovered in about a week. By February of 1722, Boston was free of smallpox, but the total number of cases over the previous 10 months came to 5,889 with a fatality number of 844 deaths, which is a rate of about 14%. Boylston, meanwhile, had actually inoculated 287 people, and there were only 6 resulting deaths, so he had a very successful 2% fatality rate. And while it would seem that this would be an obviously successful demonstration of inoculation, it actually started a pretty heated debate that remained unsettled for another 60 years with both medical and religious opposition to the practice. Unsurprisingly, I guess, and we probably see it more today too, there was a politicization of both inoculation and smallpox more generally, particularly around the time of the American Revolutionary War. This is an interesting item I found while I was doing some research for this talk. It's from the Essex Journal, February 8th, 1775, and it blames a smallpox outbreak in Manchester, New Hampshire on somebody who was either selling tea in the area or from the drinking of the tea itself. So of course, February of 1775, it was really just a little more than a year after the Boston Tea Party, and drinking tea could have seen you tarred and feathered in some communities. So I guess there's you can see what leanings tea was given, making you sick with smallpox here. The American Revolutionary War also coincided with a smallpox outbreak that was brought on by, as you can imagine, ideal conditions for contagion. There were military encampments, there were besieged cities that saw really fast spread of smallpox. Sailors, soldiers, and fleeing civilians would carry the disease throughout the colonies. There's a historian, her name is Elizabeth Fenn, and she pointed out that the epidemic probably took 5 times as many lives as the actual war did. It hit Native American populations particularly hard. Throughout the fall and winter of 1775, smallpox raged in the city of Boston. And when the British finally evacuated in March of 76, George Washington would only allow soldiers into Boston who already had smallpox because he knew they were immune. The Army Heritage Center notes that Washington faced a difficult choice of whether or not he should inoculate his army, because until mid-1776, the only authorized preventative measure was isolating anybody who was sick. Inoculation was actually forbidden, although many soldiers would secretly inoculate themselves. By 1777, though, Washington had become convinced that only inoculation would save his army. So while he was encamped in Morristown, Virginia, which was a state that forbade inoculation, he secretly ordered all of his troops to be inoculated. He ultimately saw fewer than 1% of his soldiers die from the treatment. So again, seems fairly successful. It wasn't until that same year, 1776, that the Massachusetts General Court passed an act approving county smallpox inoculation hospitals, and this is a newspaper article about that act. The notice was published in the August 9th Essex Journal. It details the supervision, the penalties, and many of the things required for a quarantine hospital. And actually of note, and it's probably difficult to read, but at the beginning of this notice, it specifically mentions the American Army and that they'd been inoculated. Like many towns, even after Massachusetts passed this act in 1776, Newbury and Newburyport debated the efficacy of inoculation. Differing opinions would sometimes translate into public policies that would change sometimes. So as an example, in Coffin's history, he notes that November of 1773, inoculation was prohibited in Newbury. And then you can see here between 1777 through the summer of 78, the town of Newbury would continue to debate and vote, and finally it resulted in inoculation hospital being operated on Kent's Island, but which was discontinued when the town again prohibited inoculation. So, there was no real consensus. And, there was a real risk of people being infected with smallpox to be inoculated, and they would die. Although, we've seen just the few cases I've mentioned, it's been small percentages. But by 1792, the merits of smallpox inoculation finally sort of won out, and the Massachusetts legislature ended up writing a whole new act that superseded the one from 1776 to establish inoculation hospitals in various counties. The new act was close to the original, but it had some changes. For example, physicians now had to post a bond of 500 pounds sterling with the treasurer of whatever community they were going to practice inoculating in. So by October of the next year, 1793, you can see Newburyport finally acquiesced, and the Essex Journal notes here on October 30th, the opening of an inoculating hospital in the course of the next week. Within 5 years, smallpox inoculation actually would become a very normal and much safer course of medicine after Edward Jenner discovered in 1798 that cowpox, which is a much less deadly viral strain, could be used to produce the same lifetime immunity to its deadlier cousin, smallpox. So also in 1793, while smallpox was subsiding throughout the states, there was another epidemic that would affect port cities in particular, and that was the yellow fever epidemic. It started in Philadelphia. In August of that year, a cluster of cases was recognized by a doctor in town. It's good that he did recognize it because it had been the first outbreak of cases in about 30 years, and he was old enough to have remembered the previous time that it had happened. They identified the start of this at Arch Street Wharf in Philadelphia, and by November, more than 5,000 people out of a population of 50,000 had died. People were fleeing the city, probably 20,000 people left the city at that point. Major port cities like Baltimore and New York, they instituted quarantines against both people, ships, and goods from Philadelphia. And Newburyport was no different. You can see here is an example of a news article from the Essex Journal, September of 1793. And it gives a lengthy account of the epidemic in Philadelphia. And if you read through the whole article, it actually talks about, there was deaths of people within 8 to 10 hours of showing symptoms, and sometimes more than 40 a day dying. And the paper also includes this public notice here on the right that vessels from specifically Philadelphia, but also the West Indies, had to be quarantined until they were given a certificate from the local health officer to be able to get off the ship. The same newspaper also published several health tips, and including not leaving dead animal carcasses in the street, which seems like it would be obvious, but it also was fairly forward thinking, as it also asked people to clear drains of stagnant water. So that was probably something good. And then yellow fever, of course, would reappear in Newburyport and other port cities. I think I mentioned just about every season. In his history, Caleb Cushing notes 38 deaths from yellow fever in 1796, including this fellow here, Dr. John Swett, at the age of 45. And you can see at the end of the small obituary there, he says he fell sacrifice to his fidelity in exercising his profession during a calamitous period when yellow fever prevailed in Newburyport. As merchant ships would return from the West Indies during the spring and summer months every year, sailors would bring yellow fever. And August and September were sometimes referred to as a time of sickening, actually, in the newspaper. So, because yellow fever is a mosquito-borne illness, it disappears every year as the cold weather sets in during the fall, which kills the mosquito population. And while recognition of the mosquito's role in transmitting yellow fever wasn't known until the late 19th century, observation of this, summer-fall pattern led to seasonal quarantines being instituted around 1800. So this is a good example of the kind of annual quarantine notice that would appear in the newspaper every spring. This is from the Newburyport Herald, June 10th of 1808, June 10th of 1808. And it notes that starting on the 1st of June, any vessels from the West Indies or the tropics, or carrying any sailor who shows basically any sign of anything, smallpox, fever, plague is even mentioned in here, is restricted to anchor below the piers, and that they had to perform quarantine and be purified, which means they had to be smoked, basically, including all of their clothing, their bedding, and the cargo aboard the ship. The notice right in the middle of the slide there, it says they are to hoist the red flag, which would be delivered to them by the town's health officer on the mainmast of the ship. It had to be kept up the whole time during the quarantine. And no person or cargo was allowed to either enter or leave the ship, except and until they were told they could by the selectman and the health officer. So I want to talk now about the first sort of modern style pandemic, I guess, that we might recognize in the more modern sense, which was a sort of a truly global illness spread by international travel. And that was an Asiatic cholera outbreak from 1826 to 1837. It was actually the second time that there had been a cholera pandemic. It just hadn't reached Europe and the Americas before, but earlier in 1817 and through 1824, a cholera outbreak that started in Calcutta spread to Southeast Asia. It got all the way to the Middle East, to East Africa, and actually to the Mediterranean coast before it sort of died out. This second wave that began in 1826, it spread along trade routes. You can basically follow it. It was in China by 1828, it was in Afghanistan and Iran by 1829, and Japan and Russia 1830. By the end of 1831, cholera was all throughout Europe, and in 1832 it had spread to Quebec, Ontario, and Nova Scotia, finally arriving here in the United States, first in Detroit and New York, and then all the way to the Pacific by 1833. Cholera is a bacterial infection that causes very extreme diarrhea and dehydration, which can actually lead to shock and death within a few hours if it's not caught and treated properly. So I thought it was kind of interesting to follow the national 1832 cholera pandemic locally through the Newburyport newspapers. So I've got a few here. Starting on January 3rd, 1832, with a New Year address by the Honorable Caleb Cushing. I think it's a name familiar pretty much to everybody on this call, so I'll just assume you know he was a big man about town. He had just returned from 2 years in Europe, and Cushing was running to win back his seat in the Massachusetts state legislature. He ran this address in the newspaper for New Year's, and he notes, for example, we have cause as a nation to give our thanks for the unusual exemption of sickness enjoyed by us and almost alone of all the nations on earth. He notes a recent disorder in a portion of the country, which has appeared generally in so mild a form that it fails to inspire terror. And then he goes on to mention specifically cholera, which is, he notes here, it's really no more worrisome than the flu, and it has carried consternation through Europe, although it's far from being viewed as an impending disaster. So, I mean, I guess you can probably guess what's coming, right? By March of 1832, people were following the news from Europe. You can see here in a newspaper from March 6th that this is the Herald, also the Newburyport Herald. The fatality rate in England, based on the numbers published here, is something like 32%. It specifically mentions fever, which that's cholera, in Glasgow, so Scotland. And by the end of the month, on the right, the paper was now reporting rumors of cholera in Maine. And you can see, their informant couldn't get any reason for believing cholera had any existence in the place. Again, he thought it was a rumor. So that's March. On April 10th, the Herald published this little article here, and it called "Rumors of Cholera in New Orleans, Mobile, Alabama, Maine, New York." They said it was ridiculous. And they took the occasion, if you notice at the end here, to say, "We hope editors of papers who are in fact men will not make old women of themselves by giving countenance to such idle tales." No. Famous last words, as you can imagine. June 22nd now, you can see the headline, the cholera. Page 6 of the newspaper, they note that they will publish extensive cholera details so that readers will be able to follow the progression of cholera. And the newspaper notes, which has so suddenly broken out on our borders. Oh, I guess those rumors from a couple months ago had some truth after all. No. Details in the paper of this date show that New York and Vermont boards of health were sending representatives to Montreal at that point to get firsthand information, that New York's clergymen had already set aside a day of fasting and prayer in view of the disease's approach, and that camphor, which was sort of a traditional medication, had already increased in price from $1 to $2.50 a pound. By July, New York was in the middle of the epidemic, and Newbury and Newburyport both found it necessary to publish in the newspaper that they were extending quarantine regulations to New York vessels. You can see both notices here. And then actually, fortunately, as we can see in this August 21st newspaper, quarantine procedures do seem to have worked as intended, and port cities generally north of New York appear to have been spared the worst of the pandemic. This article in the paper shows 2 cases of cholera in Portland Harbor in Maine, and both were aboard a quarantine ship. If you look down below, large numbers of illness and death in both Philadelphia and New York. So I did, with what research I did, I actually couldn't find any evidence for cholera in Newburyport during this pandemic in the newspapers or otherwise. Excuse me. Neither Coffin's history or Currier's history actually mentioned cholera at all, although they both mentioned smallpox and yellow fever. And Euphemia Vale Blake's history of Newburyport, she specifically notes in there at one point, the town is subject to no epidemic diseases and the cholera has never effected a lodgment there, so. So by the end of that year, 1832, cholera had moved west and south, and the paper had returned to providing only these sort of small news items about cholera. This November 29th edition here, for example, notes actually 2,000 cholera deaths in 12 days in New Orleans, which is terrible, although it was now considered over there. And there were 16 deaths the previous week in Cincinnati. So I'm going to wind down here a little bit because, of course, I can't go through all of these things, but small disease outbreaks would, of course, continue throughout the 19th century in the US and in Newburyport. And it finally culminates in the early 20th century with the Spanish influenza pandemic in 1918, which some estimates are that 500 million people were killed, which would have been about a third of the population of the globe at the time. For a synopsis of Newburyport's place in the Spanish influenza pandemic, I'd suggest that you read Bethany DeRau's recent, wonderful, succinct article in the newspaper, Learning Lessons from 1918 Influenza Epidemic. It was in the March 25th, 2020 Daily News, and I can't do any justice to it more than she did, so I would recommend you read that. In closing, I'd be remiss again not to mention the current pandemic and the national quarantine around COVID-19 coronavirus. And I find that there's probably not much I can say from a historical perspective, at least not yet, apart from any parallels that you maybe have been able to draw from some of what I presented this evening. And while we hear COVID-19 and the global reaction to it is unprecedented, which is certainly true in many ways, the scale of the response, the global speed of the transmission, there are some historical precedents in earlier epidemics that we can appreciate. And I hope that many of you will take the opportunity now to record your own thoughts during this time, whatever that looks like, whether it's art, diary entries, anything. So future historians living through the next unprecedented pandemic can look back at what we did now for meaning and insight and what precedents we set during this time. So thank you.
Great, Kevin. I've unmuted. I've set the switch so people can unmute themselves and ask questions. So let's go ahead and move into the Q&A session.
Anybody?
Don't be shy. You can ask questions or submit questions in the chat. I see Brian has asked about polio in Newburyport.
I don't know anything specific about polio. It was pretty, it's obviously something that affected children more than anything, and it went throughout the, the mid-50s. It was prevalent in pretty much most areas of the US. I guess I don't know a lot about specifically polio. I was concentrating on some of the earlier stuff. But of course, that's something that's been eradicated via now inoculation.
Hey.
Kevin, this is Bob Watts.
Hello.
Oh, I'm sorry. Just a quick question. When you said they quarantined a ship in the harbor that may have come up like from Barbados or something.
Yeah.
Obviously, there probably ended up being some sick people on that ship.
Yeah.
But the whole crew would stay on, and
yes, correct.
would the crew themselves try to quarantine from the sailors that were sick, and
these ships were
what kept the whole boat from not getting sick?
Yeah, I mean, there wasn't really a lot of places to hide, so I'm sure just common sense, some sailors would have tried to stay away from the sickest people. Sorry, I think my internet glitched there for a second. But yeah, they would try and stay away, but it was pretty, they couldn't come up past, the half-tide rocks basically, and they had to stay out in the river until, like I said, there was all kinds of regulations like flying the red flag. So that was an order for anybody to not come or go at all onto that vessel. So.
I've got a question for you.
Sure.
Were these ships with the carrier ships, were they met with with guns on them, or, I mean, how aggressive was that situation at times?
So when quarantines were enforced, early on, like in the 18th century, you know, some ships would put in, but they'd be quarantined there'd be quarantine houses set up like for example, the one that they call a hospital in the Great Passenger. So they'd have people quarantined in that way. But yeah, for a lot of the ships, you were kept in the river essentially, so that nobody could get to you unless it was on purpose, basically.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, was it enforced? Yes, it was enforced. I mean, I don't think there were any running battles or anything with anybody in the river. But
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
The hospital in the Great Pasture, was that like tents or was it a real building?
There was probably a combination. They could throw up like little, well, so tents are easy, but you could also put up, you know, little wooden sort of cabins or structures pretty fast. So, and the hospital's probably not the right, you know, they call it hospital, but really it was really just a place where you'd wait out your infection essentially. So. Not a ton of care given.
Kevin, this is Joan. I'm actually receiving, sorry, I should put on my video.
No, that's fine, Joe.
I was, Jack won't let me in just yet, but that's okay. I understand that there was some questioning about the color choice of flag. You know, I know that you had chosen the topic as being red, and then there was some concern about the yellow. And I heard back from you a very nice explanation, and perhaps you can just sort of let people know what your findings were on the various diversity of the colors.
Yeah, so red was, you know, I don't think it was specific to Newburyport, but I mean, you know, that was what this town did. Their port authorities essentially made quarantine ships fly a red flag. More generally, the question is, you know, were quarantine ships supposed to fly a yellow flag? And yes, that was a sort of an international standard through the mid to later 19th century. So there were ships that would fly, and again, it was the Yellow Jack, right? And we saw that Yellow Jack was because there were ships that would fly a yellow flag, and because the sailors, the jacks, they'd carry yellow fever essentially. And what's kind of interesting is more now modern signal flags, if you fly sort of a yellow flag now, it means that you're actually requesting somebody to come aboard and certify you that you're okay, that you're not quarantined. So it's kind of done a 180.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I saw a couple of other questions about anywhere in your research, did you see either lessons that we could learn, such as wearing masks or having a certain specified time for quarantine?
Yeah, so I mean, time for quarantine is kind of interesting because, of course, you know, the quarantine was lifted when there was no indication of sickness.
We're not muted.
So, you know, I whether you were still carrying something, nobody really knew that in the, you know, the 18th and 19th century necessarily. So if the health inspector came aboard and he said, okay, everybody seems fine, then that was it. The quarantine was over.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions? I could read a few more.
Yeah, I got a question. Hey, Kevin, it's Art Levine.
Hey, Art, how you doing?
Good, I'm good. Very interesting talk. Thank you. You were talking about inoculations.
Yes.
Did a doctor, did he bleed somebody and use the blood? Did he use?
No, it was actually, you know, smallpox. It creates raised bumps on the skin that eventually weep, if that's the nicest way to say it. So he would take that discharge from a smallpox lesion and cut somebody, usually on the arm or leg, and put that substance basically into the cut. So.
Okay. So, but for influenzas or things like that back in the 1800s, they weren't bleeding people, were they, to exchange blood?
No. No, I mean, medicine had progressed far enough that they weren't really bleeding people much for anything. So.
That's okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question, Kevin. I'm just really curious. I just saw the question about the special places or specific places in cemeteries. I know Newburyport has quite a few cemeteries, and I do recall reading for quarantine.
Sorry,
Given me that copy to read. I am not familiar. I've never seen a cemetery historically marked as an area specific for, diseases of people that have been mass interned. Is anyone aware of that in Newburyport? I'd just be really curious. I know that there's a lot of people who have done research and are quite knowledgeable about the cemeteries, but can anyone answer that question?
I don't have an answer for Newburyport, but on the Big Island in Hawaii, there is I know there is a smallpox cemetery area that to this day they won't dig into it or do any kind of archaeological survey or anything in that area because there's still some kind of belief that there might be something active there. That I volunteered on a dig over there at one point, and that particular area it was a Japanese cemetery. It was off limits, and that was the reasoning behind it. Was they had buried, I think it was actually smallpox victims there. So.
Right, because it most likely would have been a mass grave.
Yeah, it was a mound. It was a mound.
And Lyme was just sort of, I mean, it just horrific when you think of it, of having people.
Yeah, I mean, some of the early epidemics of Native Americans, there's English accounts of, dead natives laying all over the place because there wasn't enough of their tribesmen left to bury them or do anything with them, basically. So,
yeah, definitely horrific. We have a few more minutes if there's anybody else that would like to ask a question. I'm kind of trying to monitor the chat, but feel free to turn on your microphone.
I understand there was, we had anthrax came in from sheep, right? And wool. But was that in the 1800s up in Manchester?
I don't know that specifically. Yeah, anthrax is pretty contagious too, but unless you have kind of an open cut and you're dealing with animals that have it's not necessarily something that will infect you easily. So yeah, Manchester, I guess that makes sense if they had some kind of farming community up there. But I don't know that. I heard that specifically.
I heard it was the mills up there. They were using wool to make it. And
okay.
Like our issue with our meat packing, the people were in close proximity and it passed between them.
I mean, it would normally pass from animals. I don't know about, if there was somebody shipping wool here or to Manchester. I don't know how likely it is that anthrax survives just in the wool.
I noticed in the chat, Phyllis Levine raised her hand. Just unmuting her if you have a question. Oh, maybe. Oh, there she is.
We're all set. Yeah, we already asked.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, if there's no further question, I think Kevin did a tremendous job digging out some really tangible resources using the newspapers and various diaries, and that's always a wonderful resource in which you can draw information from. But this is difficult, the things that we're going through, but as everyone is saying, we're in this together. But when you look through history, we've always been in this together. So I think, we just need to make sure we stay safe and stay healthy and one day the numbers will decrease and we'll get back, but hopefully we'll take some lessons learned and still prioritize what we love and learn and like in our lives. So thank you for Kevin for joining us.
Well, thank you. I'm really glad to virtually see a lot of people again. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin.
All right.
Yeah, can you post that donation address again?
Sure. Donate the donate.thechmm.org, and I'll put that in the chat. So,
Kevin, I personally want to thank you for coming tonight and putting this presentation together for all of us. I mean, it was a very quick ask, and we so appreciate seeing you, being part of the family, and looking forward to our next venture together.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Sue.
We know that's coming up, all right? So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks.